The first thing you need to understand is that I wasn't supposed to be there. Not on Vailithor, not in Sector 9, not anywhere near that cold, humming station at the edge of the Cathara Reach where the stars looked wrong, too close together, like someone had packed them in without thinking about the space between. I was a supply runner, that's it. Cargo manifest, dock codes, signature on the line, gone by morning. That was the job. That was the arrangement. Humans didn't linger on Vailithor, not because we weren't allowed, technically, but because it was one of those places where you felt the permission was only barely there. Like a door held open just wide enough for you to slide through sideways. The Vailithari didn't dislike humans exactly. Dislike implies some kind of investment. They just didn't factor us in. We existed somewhere in their peripheral awareness the way you're aware of background noise. Present, unremarkable, easily ignored. I had been making the supply run to Sector 9 for about 4 standard months when I first noticed the sounds. Let me back up a little. Vailithor Station 9 wasn't what most people picture when they imagine a galactic hub. It wasn't gleaming. It wasn't grand. It was a working station, utilitarian to the bone, with walls the color of an old bruise and corridors that smelled faintly of something I can only describe as burnt copper and wet stone. The gravity was slightly off from what my body expected. Not enough to make you stumble, just enough to make your legs feel like they were having a private argument with the floor every time you took a step. The docking bays were in the lower ring, 6 levels down from the main concourse, accessible by lifts that moved too slowly and made a sound like someone clearing their throat every time the doors closed. Down there, away from the administrative levels and the transit corridors that the official personnel used, things were different. Quieter, darker, more honest in a way. The lower ring was where the maintenance crews worked, where the recycling systems hummed their endless, humid hum, where the station's less official supply chains moved goods that the upper levels pretended not to need. My contact was a Vailithari dockworker named Sereth, tall, four-armed, with the characteristic slate blue skin of the northern colony caste, and a way of looking at you that suggested he was calculating something even when he was just standing still. Sereth didn't talk much. We had a good working relationship because of that. He would meet me at Bay 12, check my manifest, key in the offload codes, hand me my receipt chip, and that was it. Maybe 6 words exchanged total, maybe 8 if the cargo was unusual. I liked Sereth. I trusted him the way you trust someone when you've never seen them do anything untrustworthy, which is a specific kind of trust, not deep, not tested, but real. The sound started on my 4th run. I was waiting in the bay while the automated offloaders processed the cargo, big, boxy machines that moved on magnetic rails and handled the heavy containers with a kind of robotic indifference that I found strangely comforting. Sereth had gone to deal with something. A seal malfunction on one of the pressure doors, I think. He disappeared down a side corridor without explanation, which was normal for him, and I was just sitting on one of the equipment crates with my tablet, updating my log. And then I heard it. A sound from behind the ventilation partition. The big gray panel on the far wall, the one with the maintenance access hatch that was always locked. From behind it, something that didn't fit. A small sound, soft, almost like no, definitely like something crying. I put down my tablet. I sat very still the way you do when you're not sure if you actually heard something, or if the station's ambient noise is playing tricks. The recycling units made weird sounds sometimes. The pressure systems could hiss and moan in ways that almost sounded vocal. I'd been on enough stations to know that you could convince yourself of almost anything if you listened long enough. But this wasn't that. It came again. Not one sound, 2, maybe 3. Small, irregular, with that particular quality that I couldn't explain then, and I'm still not sure I can explain now. It was the quality of something alive and small and frightened trying very hard not to be heard. I stood up slowly. I walked to the partition, which felt absurd even as I did it. A human supply runner investigating a ventilation panel on an alien station in a sector where he had no official business beyond cargo delivery. And I pressed my palm flat against the gray metal surface. Still warm. Station equipment, especially ventilation housing, tends to hold heat. But the sounds had stopped the moment I moved. Whatever was behind that panel knew I was there. I didn't say anything about it that day. I filed my log, collected my receipt, and took the lift back up to the concourse. I booked my overnight dock like I always did. Vailithor had a 6-hour minimum turnaround for human-class vessels, something to do with atmospheric recalibration protocols that may or may not have been entirely necessary. And I went to the transit lounge on level 3 and ate the worst meal I'd had in about 2 months. But I kept thinking about those sounds. On my next run, 3 weeks later by the standard calendar, though time on the Kethara reach always felt elastic, I brought extra rations. Not because I knew anything for certain. I just brought them. I packed an extra supply pouch into my personal carry. Standard field rations, the kind humans use for long-haul transit. Self-heating pouches, calorie-dense, not exactly palatably exciting, but nourishing in the way that fuel is nourishing. I also threw in a couple of the flavored protein bars that I'd been given by a vendor on my last port stop and hadn't gotten around to eating. I told myself I was being practical. I was always telling myself practical things on those runs. Bay 12, automated offloaders. Sarath with his slate blue skin and his clipboard equivalent and his thorough lack of small talk. The usual. Sarath went to check something at the far end of the bay, a signal irregularity in the tracking system, he said, which was 2 words more than he usually offered by way of explanation. I was left alone with the machines. I moved toward the partition. I had the ration pouch open in my hand, feeling approximately as ridiculous as a grown person can feel. Standing in a docking bay on an alien station, holding food out toward a maintenance panel. "Hey," I said quietly, not loud, not the way you'd call out in a normal situation, the way you'd talk to something you didn't want to spook. "It's okay, I'm not going to tell anyone." Silence. The recyclers hummed. An offloader unit passed behind me on its rail, going about its business. And then the sounds again, closer this time, or maybe I was just listening harder. "I brought food," I said, feeling even more ridiculous, and then I noticed something I hadn't caught before. The maintenance hatch, the one I'd always assumed was locked, had a latch mechanism on this side. It was a manual lever, corroded at the joint, the kind that hadn't been used in a long time. I pulled it. The hatch swung open. 3 of them. There were 3 of them in the crawlspace behind the partition. Young, very young, I would learn later just how young, but even in that first moment I knew. Vailithari juveniles, huddled together against the far wall of the maintenance corridor with the particular stillness of creatures that have learned that stillness is protection. They were thin, noticeably thin, in the way that makes you feel something physical in your chest when you see it. Their slate blue skin was duller than it should have been. I knew enough about Vailithari to know that vibrancy of coloration in their kind is directly tied to health and nutrition. These 3 looked like the color had been slowly leached out of them. The biggest one, barely coming up to my mid-chest if he'd been standing, which he wasn't, moved in front of the other 2. Protective, automatic, the kind of gesture that doesn't come from thought, just from being the oldest. All 3 of them were staring at me. Not with the measured, calculating look of an adult Vailithari, with something rower than that. Fear, yes, but also something underneath the fear, something exhausted. I crouched down, which brought me closer to their eye level, and I held out the ration pouch. "It's food," I said, "human food. I don't know if it'll taste right to you, but it's safe. It won't hurt you." The big one, the protector, didn't move. But he didn't look away from the pouch either. The smallest one, the one on the far right, made a sound, very quiet, very small, and reached out one of her 4 hands toward the pouch without moving the rest of her body. I set the pouch down on the floor of the crawlspace and stepped back. Here's the thing about moments that change your life. They never announce themselves. You don't get a warning, no signal, no sense that you're standing at a fork in the road. You just make a decision that feels almost accidental, and then you live with it for the rest of your years. I decided in that moment that I was going to come back. That's all. That was the whole decision. It wasn't grand. It wasn't heroic. It was just, I'm going to come back. I straightened up, looked at the 3 small faces watching me from the dimness of that crawlspace, and said, I'll be back in 3 weeks. I'll bring more. Then I closed the hatch quietly, walked back to my position by the cargo, and waited for Sarath like nothing had happened. I spent those 3 weeks doing 2 things: my regular work and research. The research was careful. The kind of careful where you use public databases only. You frame your searches as academic curiosity. You don't save anything to your personal files. I learned things about Veilithari juveniles, their dietary requirements, their developmental stages, what deficiency looked like in their species versus what was normal variation. I learned about the Station 9 administrative records, which were public enough to tell me that the lower maintenance levels of the station were technically unoccupied and unmaintained past the primary service corridor. Below that, below the threshold where Sarath and I did our business, there was officially nothing. I also learned, in the careful sideways way that you learn things when you're looking for what isn't being said, that Veilithar had experienced a significant administrative disruption 16 months prior. A restructuring of the caste governance that had affected, among other things, the tracking and welfare allocation systems for dependents of deceased or displaced workers. Dependents' children. The polite, bureaucratic language of people who have stopped looking at something they'd rather not count. 3 weeks later, I brought real food. I'd spent time, more time than was probably wise, given my schedule, figuring out what Veilithari juveniles actually needed. Their biology wasn't a secret. There was enough general galactic xenobiology in the public record to piece together the basics. High in mineral compounds, particularly those containing structured lattice proteins. Carbohydrate equivalent from processed root fiber sources. The flavoring preferences of Veilithari tended towards savory mineral rather than sweet. They lacked the biological hardware to process simple sugars efficiently, which meant human candy bars were useless and possibly mildly toxic. What I settled on was a combination of Theron seed meal, which was available at the transit market on the main concourse level, and was exactly the kind of thing that wouldn't attract attention from a supply runner buying provisions, and something called dried keyleth strips that a vendor 2 stalls over kept in stock for the Veilithari transit passengers. I added protein concentrate in a form that I'd confirmed was cross-compatible with their digestive chemistry, and a vitamin mineral suspension that was technically developed for Kithran mammals, but shared enough biological overlap with Veilithari requirements that a xenobiology paper I'd found in the academic records had noted its potential utility. I portioned all of it into sealed carry bags, packed it into the bottom of my personal hold under a layer of legitimate personal supplies, and told myself I wasn't doing anything extraordinary. I was just bringing food. Bay 12 Sarath, offloaders. The hatch. This time when I opened it, the 3 of them were already there, closer to the front than before, not waiting with the same desperate stillness as the first time. This waiting had a different quality. Anticipation, maybe, or just familiarity with the idea that I came back. The big one, I'd started thinking of him as eldest, without meaning to give him a name, looked at my bag with those calculating adult-type eyes of his, and then looked at me, And there was something in that look that I've thought about many times since. It wasn't gratitude, not exactly. It was assessment. He was assessing me, trying to determine what I wanted, what this cost. "I'm not going to tell anyone," I said again, because that seemed like the most important thing. The small one, the youngest, was already at the front of the crawlspace reaching for the bags. No hesitation this time. The middle one, who I'd come to think of as second, watched me with an expression I couldn't fully read and didn't try to. I handed the bags through the hatch, 3 of them, 1 for each. "I'll be back," I said. Eldest looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something in low Vailithari, a dialect I didn't fully speak, though I knew the standard form well enough. 2 syllables, quiet. I found out later what the words meant. I'll get to that. 3 weeks became 12 weeks became 6 months. Every run to Vailithar I brought food. I got better at it, the sourcing, the packaging, the nutritional balance. I learned what they liked and what they didn't. The youngest one, she eventually signed her name to me in the Vailithari notation system, which I would roughly transliterate as Vessi, though she later told me in her limited standard language that it actually meant something closer to bright below the surface, which I found strangely accurate. Vessi was enthusiastic about food in a way that was contagious. She would inspect whatever I brought with a seriousness that was genuinely funny, and then eat with a focused intensity that made me feel like I was doing something right. Eldest ate carefully. He always rationed himself, even when there was clearly enough. I noticed that. Second ate quietly and watched me every time. I learned a few things across those 6 months that I should probably have known sooner. Their names first. Eldest was Karath, second was Dema, and Vessi, bright below the surface, was the youngest by a full developmental cycle. Karath was, by Vailithari reckoning, at the tail end of what their culture called the tending period, that long phase of childhood where they're old enough to understand but still too young to legally exist as independent entities in the social structure. Dema was mid-tending. Vessi was barely into it. They'd been in that maintenance corridor for 9 months before I found them. 9 months. I didn't ask how the first time. I waited because I could tell it wasn't something to push on. But over the weeks and months, in the combination of low Vailithari and limited standard language and the improvised gestural shorthand we developed, the story came through. There had been one parent, it seemed. Their biological progenitor unit was how Vailithari structured it, though the emotional reality of what I was hearing was simply, their mother, their parent, had been a maintenance worker on the station, lowering staff. Not the kind whose records were carefully kept. When the administrative restructuring happened 16 months before I found them, she had been listed in a processing error as relocated rather than deceased, a clerical displacement. The kind of mistake that only matters if someone is looking. No one was looking. Karath had been the one to figure out the crawlspace. He'd been the one to find the water reclamation access that gave them something to drink. He'd been the one to figure out that certain maintenance robots, particularly the ones that handled organic waste sorting, could be diverted by a specific interference pattern he'd figured out how to generate using a piece of broken equipment he'd found. Karath was 11 years old by the nearest human equivalent, and had kept his siblings alive for 9 months in a maintenance corridor. I think about that a lot. The other thing I learned over those months was that they weren't entirely alone in the world. There was someone. A figure at the edge of what they told me, present in their conversations in a way that felt significant, someone they spoke of with a particular kind of carefully maintained hope. Someone whose return they were waiting for. I didn't understand fully for a while who this person was. The word they used when they spoke of her was Sethara, which in standard Vailithari means something like the one who keeps, the keeper. It's a specific relational term for a particular kind of bond in their culture, not just a guardian, something older and more binding than that. Their Sethara was the reason they were on Vailithar Station 9, the reason they'd stayed. She had left, gone somewhere, for reasons they weren't entirely clear on or chose not to explain, and she would come back. They said that with a certainty that was a little hard to hear. The certainty of children who have not yet had enough reason to stop believing. Dima said it with the most certainty. Dima, the quiet one, the watcher. She had this way of speaking about the Sethara that was different from how children usually talk about people they're waiting for. Not wishful, factual, matter of fact in a way that I couldn't dismiss. She's coming back, Dima would say in her careful mix of Veilithari and broken standard. She said she would come back. She doesn't say things and not do them. 7 months in. I want to be honest about where things stood at 7 months in, because I think it's important for what comes next. I was compromised, in the professional sense. I had been using my cargo access to bring undeclared goods onto a restricted sector station for most of a year. If anyone had checked my personal carry logs carefully, and they hadn't, because supply runners are the kind of people nobody checks carefully unless something goes wrong, the pattern would have been obvious, recurring, deliberate. It would not have been easy to explain. I was also compromised in the other sense, the one that isn't professional. I knew these 3 kids. That's the honest way to say it. I knew them. I knew that Kareth hated the mineral suspension I brought but drank it anyway because it was nutritionally necessary, and he had that kind of relationship with practicality that I found both admirable and a little heartbreaking. I knew that Dima had learned to read standard language script from a discarded cargo manifest she'd found in the corridor, and was quietly becoming frighteningly literate in a language she'd had no formal instruction in. I knew that Vesey sang to herself in the dark, not real songs, just sounds she made up, rhythmic and odd and entirely hers. 7 months in, I was not a supply runner who had happened to find some kids and was helping them out. I was someone who was waiting, a little desperately, for each 3-week cycle to come around so I could go back and make sure they were still okay. That's the honest version. What I was not doing, and this is important, was fixing anything. I kept telling myself that the situation would resolve, that the administrative systems would eventually catch the error and redirect some kind of official support, that there would be a natural transition point at which Kareth would age into a status that gave him legal standing to petition for his siblings' welfare registration, that the Sethara they were waiting for would return, as Dima absolutely insisted she would. What I was not doing was going upstairs, going to the administrative level, filing a report, bringing this into the light in any official way. I had reasons for this. Some of them were the good kind. I had genuine uncertainty about whether involving the station's administrative apparatus would result in a better outcome for these 3 specific children. I'd seen what happened in bureaucratic edge cases across species. I'd seen children disappear into processing, with no clear trajectory toward anything resembling welfare. The Veilithari administrative restructuring had created the gap that swallowed their parent. I was not confident that the same system, approached again, would not swallow them. Some of my reasons were not the good kind. Some of them were simpler than I wanted to admit. I was afraid, not for myself, or not only for myself, but afraid of what change might look like, of handing this to someone else and losing the thread of it, of the machinery of official process moving these 3 somewhere I couldn't find them. That's not virtue, I know that, but it's the truth. Month 8 I arrived at Bay 12, and Sareth wasn't there. This had happened before, occasionally. He'd send a proxy, another Veilithari dockworker, with a brief note explaining the substitution. Nothing unusual. I processed my cargo with the proxy, who was efficient and even more taciturn than Sareth, and when the offloaders were running, I moved toward the partition. The proxy was watching me. Not obviously, not the way someone watches you when they're suspicious, more the way someone watches you when they're trying to look like they're not watching you. I opened the hatch, passed through the bags, didn't linger. The faces inside were Kareth, Dema, Vesey, present, alive, still okay. I registered all of that in about 10 seconds, closed the hatch quietly, and went back to waiting for the offloaders to finish. When the proxy handed me my receipt chip, he said something in Veilithari. Low and quick, not looking at me when he said it. My Veilithari was better than it had been 8 months ago. Not fluent, but better. He said, "Be careful, something is moving upstairs." Something is moving upstairs. Turned out to be the first thing anyone had said to me that suggested the world outside that maintenance corridor was paying any attention at all to what was happening in Sector 9. I spent the 3 weeks between that run and my next one in a state that I would not describe as calm. I did more research, more careful than before. There had been a shift in the Veilithar administrative structure, not a new restructuring, something else. A senior diplomatic delegation from the Central Veilithari governance had passed through the station's official records about 2 months prior. The kind of delegation whose passage doesn't usually make public records, but leaves traces if you know where to look. The kind of delegation, I realized as I pieced it together, that might be associated with the return of someone important. I thought about what Dema had said, many times in her careful half-standard, half-Veilithari certainty. She said she would come back. She doesn't say things and not do them. My 9th run to Veilithar Station 9. Standard approach, standard dock codes, Bay 12. Sarath was back. He met me at the bay entrance the way he always did, took my manifest, began the offload process. Everything exactly the same. Except for one thing. Sarath looked at me, really looked at me, which was not something he normally did, and said in clear, slow standard language, "Today you should leave quickly." "What's happening?" I asked. He didn't answer that. He just turned back to his work. I thought about leaving. I genuinely considered it. I had my manifest. The offloaders were doing their job. There was no technical reason for me to be in Bay 12 for any length of time beyond the required sign-off. I went to the hatch. Behind the partition, everything was different. Kareth was standing up. He was dressed, not in the maintenance scraps they'd been living in, but in something that looked like it had been carefully maintained. Cleaned and pressed the Veilithari way, using the chemical process I knew their kind used for fabric treatment. His posture was different, formal in a way I'd never seen from him. Dema was the same, standing composed, her small face doing something complicated. Vesey was clutching Dema's lower right arm and looking at me with eyes that were wide and unsettled. "Kareth," I said, "what's happening?" He said something in Veilithari that I had to parse for a moment. Then I got it. "She's here." The sounds came about 40 minutes later. I was back by the cargo. I'd made myself return to the cargo, made myself stand there with my receipt in hand like I was just waiting out my mandatory turnaround when I heard it. Not from behind the partition this time. From the corridor. From the lift. The sound of someone moving through the lower ring, who was not supposed to be in the lower ring. More than one someone. Footsteps, multiple sets. The particular sound of formal Veilithari movement. There's a rhythm to it that's different from working movement, a kind of deliberate weight distribution that I'd learned to recognize. And then at the corridor entrance to Bay 12, they appeared. 4 of them. 3 were the kind of Veilithari I'd never personally encountered before, tall even by the standard of a tall species, wearing the deep indigo marks of the senior governance tier. Escort positions, very still, very controlled. The 4th was different. She was older than I'd expected. Or maybe not older, she carried age the way some people carry authority, as a feature rather than a limitation. Her skin was a deeper blue than most Veilithari I'd seen, with the particular metallic sheen in the coloring that I knew from my research, indicated the highest genetic tier of Veilithari noble lineage. Her 4 hands were held in a formal carry position. Her eyes, when they found me across the bay, were an amber I hadn't seen in any Veilithari before. Most have silver or gray eyes. Hers were the color of old sunlight. She stopped when she saw me. I didn't move. She looked at me for a long moment with an expression that I couldn't fully read, not anger, not exactly, though there was something sharp in it, and then she looked at the ventilation partition. "Human," she said. Her standard language was perfect, the kind of perfect that comes from speaking dozens of languages and deciding that accuracy was a form of respect. "This maintenance sector has been secured. You should not be present." "I'm a supply runner," I said. "Cargo delivery, Bay 12. I held up my manifest tablet in a move that felt both practical and faintly absurd. Her amber eyes went from the tablet to the partition. "You access that maintenance hatch," she said, not a question. "Yes," I said. "Why?" I thought about many things in that half-second, about what I'd promised Kareth and Dimar and Vessi. I'm not going to tell anyone. About what the honest answer was, about what the practical answer was, about Sareth saying, "Be careful, something is moving upstairs." "Because there were children behind it," I said, "and they were hungry." The silence that followed was one of the more significant silences of my life. The 3 escort Veilithari did not move, which I'd expected. What I hadn't expected was the way the woman, the one with the amber eyes, went absolutely, entirely still. Not the controlled stillness of her escort. Something different. The stillness of someone who has just been told something that they have been not knowing for a long time. She said something in Veilithari, low, to herself, I think, not to me or her escort. The words were complex and I could only catch fragments. Then she said in standard language, "How long?" 8 months, I said. "I've been making this run for about 8 months. I found them on my second visit." "How many?" 3. She closed her eyes. Just for a moment. Long enough for me to see something that I hadn't expected to see on a face that composed. Long enough for something to move underneath the surface of all that control. Then she said, "Take me to them." I opened the hatch. She looked at me when I did it, when I just reached out and opened it, and the lever moved, and the mechanism wasn't locked. The look on her face told me she understood exactly what that meant, that it had never been locked, that in 8 months, all those times the station's security had swept the lower ring without finding anything because they'd used their systems and hadn't tried the door by hand. I stepped back. She moved forward, and she looked into the crawlspace. And I heard the sound that I will probably carry with me for the rest of my life. It was Vessi. Vessi, who had been clutching Dimar's arm an hour ago with wide, frightened eyes, made a sound that started somewhere between a cry and a word, and ended as something I don't have the vocabulary to describe properly. A sound of absolute, foundational recognition. The kind of sound you make when something you had almost stopped believing in turns out to be real. Then the sound of very small, very fast movement through a crawlspace. And then, this is the part where I had to look away for a moment, because it was too much, because I am a supply runner, and I was not prepared for the way the woman with the amber eyes dropped to her knees on the floor of Bay 12, without any care at all for the formal governance marks on her garments, and opened all 4 of her arms, and caught Vessi with the practiced instinct of someone who had caught this particular child many times before. Dimar came next, more carefully. Less sound, more deliberateness. That was Dimar's way. It had always been Dimar's way. She moved through the hatch and stood in the bay and looked at the woman holding Vessi and said something in Veilithari that I understood because I'd gotten better at Veilithari. She said, "I told them you were coming back." Kareth came last. He had to duck his head to get through the hatch, and when he straightened up, this 11-year-old child who had kept his siblings alive for 9 months in a maintenance corridor with nothing but determination, and a piece of broken equipment that he'd repurposed into a robot diverting tool. When he stood up in the proper light of Bay 12 for the first time in what must have been a very long time, He looked at the woman on the floor, and his face did something that very briefly stopped being the careful, composed face of the person who had to be the oldest. He just looked like a child. She reached out one of her free hands toward him. He stepped forward and took it, and she pulled him in and held all three of them at once in the way that 4 arms allow. And she said something to them, quiet, and then she looked up at me over the top of Vessie's head. "Who are you?" she said, not unkindly. The question had a different weight now than it would have had 5 minutes ago. "Supply runner," I said, because it was true. "Why?" she said. "Why did you do this?" I thought about that. I thought about all the ways to answer it. The ones that would sound better, the ones that would sound more rational, the ones that would frame it as something principled and considered. "They were hungry," I said, "and nobody was looking for them." She was quiet for a moment. "I was looking for them," she said. There was something in the way she said it that told me this was the truth, and also that it was a truth that had cost her significantly to hold on to. "I know," I said. "I think they knew that too." She looked at me. "That is why they stayed," she said. "They knew I would come back." "Demain especially," I said. Something moved in her amber eyes. "Yes," she said, "that sounds like demain." I found out later, after the conversation that followed, which was long and thorough, and involved her escort team, and eventually a very uncomfortable 40 minutes with a Vailither Station 9 administrative officer who had been roused from whatever he did on the upper levels and brought down to Bay 12 looking significantly unhappy about it. I found out who she was. Her full title, in the formal Vailithari governance structure, was Sethara Caliph of the second governance tier, which translated very roughly into standard language as something like Queen Mother of the secondary reach. Not a ceremonial title. Vailithari don't really do ceremonial in the way humans understand it. A functional one. She administered the secondary reach of the Vailither system, which covered about 11 inhabited stations and 3 colony worlds. She was, in the scale of this part of the galaxy, a person of significant consequence. She had left Station 9 14 months ago on a governance emergency that had, and this was the part that had clearly been eating at her, extended beyond all original projections, and had been extended further by circumstances she hadn't controlled. She had left the children in the care of a station administrator who had, it turned out, been displaced by the very restructuring that had created the clerical error swallowing their parents' record. She had been trying to come back for 9 months. The mechanisms keeping her away were complicated, and I didn't fully understand them. But the short version was, governance in the Cathara reach moves slowly, and she had been caught in the grinding teeth of exactly the kind of slow-moving process that she would, in normal circumstances, have had the authority to cut through. Except that the authority she needed to use was precisely the authority under review in the governance dispute. She had been as trapped as they were, just in a different kind of crawlspace. The administrative officer, a middle-tier Vailithari named something I've chosen not to include here, for reasons that will be obvious, was the interesting part of what followed. He arrived looking put upon. He looked less put upon and more alarmed as the situation was explained to him by the Sethara Caliph's escort, who were, up close, the kind of governance-tier Vailithari that even other Vailithari addressed with careful attention to posture. He kept looking at me with an expression that oscillated between hostility and something more calculating. "The human entered a secured maintenance sector," he said at one point, which was technically true and also the least important true thing in the conversation. "The human fed my children for 8 months in a maintenance sector that your administration failed to monitor," the Sethara Caliph said, from where she was sitting on the equipment crate I'd been sitting on earlier, with Vessie asleep against her side and Demain sitting very straight beside her. "Which of those facts would you like to prioritize?" The officer had a very bad few minutes after that. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. What emerged from those 40 minutes of conversation, aside from the administrative officer's visible desire to be anywhere else, was the following. The clerical error that had misfiled the children's parents' status was traced, documented, and flagged for formal correction. The children's welfare registration was issued on an emergency basis, attached directly to the Sethara Caliph governance account, which meant it was not going to get lost in any further restructuring. And a formal notation was placed in the station's security record noting that the maintenance access in Bay 12's lower partition had been a point of failure. There was also the question of me. You are in violation of several provisions of the Vailither Station Transit Compact, the officer said to me, when he'd run out of other things to be unhappy about. Undeclared goods, restricted area access, failure to report. He reported, the Sethara Caliph said. He reported to no official. He reported to the people who needed to be told, she said. He reported by action. He brought food. He came back. 8 months. She looked at the officer with an expression that I cannot describe adequately, but it had the quality of something you don't argue with. What is the provision in the Transit Compact for actions that preserve the lives of citizens under a governance failure? The officer opened his mouth, closed it. There isn't one, he said finally. The provisions don't address that situation. Then we will need to discuss, at your earliest convenience, amending them, she said. She spoke to me privately before I left. Her escort stepped back. The officer had gone. Kareth and Dima were somewhere off to the side, and Vesey was still asleep. Vesey could sleep through anything. I had noticed over the months, another one of those small specific things I knew about her. And the Sethara Caliph stood in front of me in Bay 12, with the offloaders still running on their rails in the background, doing their indifferent mechanical work. You said they were hungry and nobody was looking, she said. But someone was looking for them. I was looking for them. The difference was that you were here. Yes, I said. I didn't have anything more useful than that. In our governance tradition, she said, there is a concept, the Vailith Keth. It means, as close as I can render it in your language, the one who acts when the systems have failed. Not a hero. Not an authority, just the one who does the thing that needs doing. She paused. It is considered a significant designation. I'm a supply runner, I said, for the 3rd time that day. Yes, she said, and the Vailith Keth historically have been exactly that, ordinary people in the right place, making the right choice. She held my gaze. Thank you. It was 2 words. In standard language, 2 completely ordinary words. I had to spend a minute not saying anything before I trusted myself to respond. Before I went through the lift to the concourse, Kareth found me. He came around the side of the cargo containers where I was doing a final check on my receipt, or pretending to. Mostly I was just standing there, and he stood in front of me with that same formal posture he'd had when I first saw him this morning. He said something in Vailithari. I recognized the words, 2 syllables, quiet. The same 2 syllables he'd said to me 8 months ago, the first time I'd passed food through a hatch in a maintenance corridor. My Vailithari was much better now than it had been then. I understood what the words meant. Roughly translated, you see us. That's what he'd said 8 months ago in the dark, when he thought I might not understand. And that's what he said again now, standing in the light, looking at me with eyes that were finally the right color, the vibrant, healthy blue of a child who'd been eating properly for 8 months and whose family had come home. You see us. I'm writing this down because I think it matters. Not because I did anything that deserves to be written down. I want to be clear about that. I brought food. I came back. I opened a hatch when I heard something that needed to be heard. Anyone could have done that. But that's the thing, isn't it? Anyone could have done it, and for 9 months no one had. Not because anyone was cruel. Not because anyone was evil or deliberately indifferent, just because systems fail. Records get lost. Restructurings happen. Things fall through gaps that everyone assumed someone else was monitoring. The stars out here on the Cathara Reach are packed too close together. That's what I said at the beginning, that they look wrong, too close, no space between. But maybe that's not the right way to think about it. Maybe they're just close enough to see each other by. I still run the Vailither supply route. Every 3 weeks, Bay 12, Sarath with his clipboard equivalent and his magnificent economy of words. I don't go to the maintenance hatch anymore. There's nothing behind it now. It's a standard maintenance corridor again, empty, the way it was supposed to be. But every time I pass it, I put my palm on it for a second. Just to remember,